Hey guys, it's Justin with Shock Therapy again, and I'm bringing you another installation video for dual rate spring kit. This spring kit is going to be for 2017 and 18 XP 1000 4-seater with Walker piggyback shocks. It's also for a 2018 XP4 Turbo with Walker piggyback shocks. This spring kit is going to do two things for you. It's going to create a much more plush ride through the mid-stroke. It's also going to give you more resistance for the big hits and jump landings. It will also reduce rear bucking and kicking, and it will also stop the nose from nosediving during jumps. Now let's take a look at all of the components that come with the spring kit and help you install them. So the first thing that we recommend with our spring kit is to lay all the components out on the workbench so that you can make sure that you have everything that you need and also set things up in order that you're going to install them. Some of the components that are included in this spring kit are 4 crossover rings, 1 per shock, 4 O-rings, which make the crossover a silent contact to the spring divider. Also, 8 coil springs, 4 for the front and 4 for the rear. Something that's really important, you want to make sure that you notice we have marked every one of these coil springs as to where they go. All of these kits are tailored specifically to your car, your accessories, and the way you drive. So this spring kit could be different than the next, or different than your friends. So different spring rates and different spring heights are common. We mark these springs for you, front upper, front lower, so that you know exactly where the springs are to be installed. Follow these marks and you'll get everything on exactly the way we need. Some of the tools that you're going to need to install this spring kit are a 15mm wrench, 18mm wrench, various ratchets, breaker bar, standard screwdriver, a persuading hammer, and various extensions in the same size sockets as the wrenches, 18 and 15. The Allen wrench is a 3/32. This Allen wrench is used for the Allens that retain our crossover rings to the shock system. The rest of the tools are mainly used to remove hardware that hold the shocks to the car, and the standard screwdriver is used to pry the bump stop down from the lower portion of the shock so that the springs can be removed. The very first step in installing the spring kit on your car is to jack up the front of the car until the tires are at least 1/2 inch off the ground. Now grab the tools that you need for the front shock bolts. That's 15mm wrench and socket. Loosen the lower shock bolt first and then go to the top shock bolt second. The reason that we have the tire 1/2 inch off the ground is so that you can put your toes underneath the tire, lifting it with your toes while you slide the bolt out easily. This will also prevent the suspension from drooping too far if you had the car jacked up higher than 1 inch off the ground. With the shocks removed from the car, place the shock in the spring compressor and compress the factory spring package. Before you compress the springs, take the standard screwdriver and push the factory bump stop down the shock shaft. This will give you enough clearance to remove the factory spring retainer once the springs are compressed. Now we understand you may not have one of these cool spring compressors, but you can get some and rent some from your local parts store. Make sure you take your time and be careful, the springs are under a lot of load. Now remove the shock from the vise and place it on the workbench so that you can set preload and crossover measurements. With the shock on the bench, you can now get ready to install the crossover rings and set your preload and crossover height. A trick that we learned is to take the crossover silent O-ring and slide that over the shock and shock body. You can use this as a guide to locate where your crossover rings are going to be placed. Use the tape measure by butting the tape measure up against the lower lip of the bridge. You can measure down 2 1/4 inches to the preload collar and measure down to 5 1/4 inches to the O-ring. That will be the location for you to place the crossover rings in the next step. To install the crossover on the shock, first remove the Allen bolts that we might have supplied loosely in the crossover. This requires a 3/32 Allen tool. Once the bolts are removed, the crossover can be placed onto the shock body so that the flat surface of the crossover is facing the top of the shock and the recessed surface of the crossover where the O-ring fits is facing the O-ring.
Perfect. Do that one more time, Brandon.
Before you completely tighten the hardware for the crossover rings, double check that the crossover ring is sitting at 5 1/4 inches down, and that is measured from the top of the bridge to the bottom of the crossover ring where the O-ring sits. Now you can repeat the same steps on the other side.
You're ready, Chris. Perfect. Perfect.
With your crossover ring located in the correct place of 5 1/4 inches, you can now slide the O-ring all the way against the crossover to hold it, and take your 3/32 Allen tool and tighten all the hardware for the crossover ring. Once the hardware is tight, you will have a gap between the two pieces of the crossover. This is done on purpose so that you always have proper pinch to the body. Once your preload collar and crossover rings are set, you can go back to the spring compressor, install the shock, and start by installing the top upper front spring. The black plastic spring divider that came with the shock factory is reused. Install it with the long end facing the shock shaft. Now grab the front lower spring, installing it onto the shock sitting on the spring divider. Make sure that the spring ends are touching the arrows in the factory spring divider. This will place both ends of the springs on opposite sides of the divider and keep the springs as straight as possible. Now compress the spring system at least 3 to 3.5 inches to get the springs as low as you need to install the lower spring perch. With the spring perch in place, release the spring tension slowly so that you can line up the lower loop of the shock inside the spring retainer. Remove the shock and repeat the process on the other front shock.
Everyone says, you don't need 4K, no one watches it in 4K.
With the springs installed on the shocks, you can now install them back on the car. Start with the upper shock bolts first, leaving the hardware loose as you install it. Using your feet underneath the tire, you can easily lift the tire and arm system just enough to get the hardware to install very easily. Make sure that you leave the hardware loose. This will make adjusting the ride height later on easier. Now slowly drop the jack and put the car on the ground. Do not worry if the car sits too high. The suspension is in a bind. It will settle once we move the car later. Now you can go to the rear of the car and jack it up until the tires are about 1/2 inch off the ground.
They do and they don't.
Huh. Grabbing the tools for the rear shocks, which are 18mm wrenches and 18mm sockets. Remove the lower shock bolts first, then go to the upper shock bolts, removing them second.
Perfect. Pull out the shock, Chris.
Now take one of the rear shocks and install it in the spring compressor. Grab your standard screwdriver and lower the lower bump stop on the shaft down the shaft at least 1 to 2 inches. This will give you enough room to remove the lower spring perch once the springs are compressed. Now compress the springs and remove the lower factory spring retainer. Remove the factory springs and then remove the shock from the spring compressor and place on the bench so that we can set all of the preload and crossover ring measurements. Now repeat the same steps on the other shock of the rear of the car.
springs are like my willy. They go.
With the rear shock on the workbench, check it with the tape measure. The tape measure should be butted up against the bottom of the bridge, and the preload collar should be set to 2 inches. The crossover ring should be set to 8 inches. We have found it easy to place the crossover ring O-ring at the 8-inch point. Check it with a tape measure and let the O-ring mark where you're going to install the crossover. With the O-ring at the 8-inch position, it's easy to install the crossover rings right above the O-ring and have them in the right spot. Using a 3/32 Allen, remove the hardware in the crossover so that you can have 2 pieces installing onto the shock body together. The crossover should be installed with the flat surface of the crossover facing the top of the shock. The recessed surface of the crossover should be facing the O-ring so that the O-ring fits inside that recess point. Install the crossover hardware loosely to hold the crossover ring in place so that you can check and adjust the crossover to the correct measurement later. Before tightening the crossover hardware completely, double check the location of the crossover. The bottom of the crossover should be at 8 inches. Once the crossover is measured to the correct spot, you can tighten it accordingly. There will always be a gap between the 2 halves of the crossover, even with the hardware tightened. This allows the crossover to have the proper amount of pinch and lock itself in place. You can now repeat the process, measuring proper preload and crossover ring location on the other shock. With the preload and crossover ring set, you can install the shock back into the spring compressor and get ready to install the springs. First, grab the upper rear spring, sliding it onto the shock. Use the plastic spring divider that came on the shock factory with the tall end facing the shaft on the shock. Install the lower spring onto the shock where the lower spring and the upper spring ends are matched up with the arrows on the plastic spring divider. This makes the ends of the spring line up on opposite sides of the divider, keeping the springs as straight as possible. Now compress the spring package enough to install the lower spring perch. When installing the lower spring perch, you're also going to be lining up the factory mud guard. Remember to have the rock guard facing the opposite direction of the shock reservoir. Remove the shock with the spring kit installed and get ready to install it on the car. You can repeat the same process for the other shock on the rear.
Walk out to the left just like Chris did.
Now you can install the rear shocks back on the car. Start with the upper bolts first, moving to the lower bolts second. Remember, you can use your toes to lift the tire up and make installing the lower shock bolt easy. With the shocks installed on the car, keeping the hardware loose, you can let it back on the ground. Now it's time to settle the suspension. Get in the car and drive it back and forth using the brakes and throttle consistently. Compress the front suspension and rear suspension as much as possible. When you've done this a few times, come back to a rolling stop without hitting the brakes and stay in the car. Have somebody else measure ride heights to determine whether the car needs to be raised or lowered from our starting points. Having the driver stay in the car, measure the front and rear ride height to determine the heights that we need to set the car. Measure your front ride height from the lower control arm, rear mount, closest to the firewall, from the bottom of the chassis at that point to the ground. With stock tires, your car should sit right around 14 inches off the ground. When measuring the rear ride height, make sure that you go to the very back of the car, dead center between the radius rod mounts, and measure from the bottom of the frame and skid plate to the ground. With stock tires, you should be right around 13.5 inches. This is a measurement that's give or take 1/4 of an inch. You can be a little bit high, a little bit low, and you'll be fine. With the driver remaining in the car, check the gap of your crossover measurement. There should be a gap between the bottom of the crossover rings and the top of the plastic spring divider of about 2 to 2.5 inches in the rear. Check your crossover height in the front. The gap between the crossover ring and the top of the plastic divider should be approximately 1 inch in the front. With the ride height set, you can tighten all the hardware on all of the shocks at this point. So with all the hardware tight on the vehicle, your installation is pretty much done. But we do want to touch upon the fact that you may have to adjust your ride height. All the spring kits are different. They're tailored to each car specifically. Every car has different accessories and every person drives differently. These things are all variables that we can't account for. Sometimes your car might sit high an inch, sometimes it might sit low an inch after you've installed the shock with our spring kit at our baseline settings. If you find yourself needing to raise or lower the car, this is absolutely normal. You can raise the front very easily. In the front, by moving the front preload collar, you can raise or lower the front of the car. If you raise the preload collar by 1/2 inch, it will lower the car 1 inch. If you lower the preload collar 1/2 inch, it will raise the car 1 inch. That's a 2-to-1 ratio. So you should be able to measure your ground clearance, see that you might be 1 inch off, and know what direction to adjust the upper preload collar, and only by half that amount. In the rear of the car, the adjustment for the preload collar is almost 1-to-1 ratio. So if you need to raise or lower the car by 1 inch of ride height, you're going to move the preload collar a little bit less than 1 inch. Somewhere in that 3/4 to 7/8 of an inch range will actually get you 1 inch of ride height. This way you can measure the car and adjust it one time. As we've shown you, once you measure your ride heights, the next thing to do is to check your crossover gap. Our baseline settings should be very close. But if you've raised or lowered the car according to our baselines, you might have to adjust the crossover ring gap. In the front, we're looking for about 1 inch. In the back, we're looking between 2 and 2.5 inches. If you find that, for instance, in the rear, you're sitting at 3 inches of crossover gap, loosen the crossover hardware and thread the crossover down the shock body. You do not have to remove the shock to do that. Bring the crossover down to the appropriate measurement and tighten it down. As with all of our dual rate spring kits, all of the springs are made in the USA and they're warranted for life. They're also brand new, which means over a period of time, for the first few hundred miles, the springs will settle in. They could settle as much as 1/2 inch to 1 inch depending on the spring rates that we used and the accessories you have on your car. Once you've reached about a 200 to 300 mile time period on our spring kit, they've probably taken a set and they're never going to move again. Measure your ride heights one more time, adjust it accordingly, and you should be fine for the rest of the life of the spring kit. Now that you've got our spring kit completely installed, ride heights set, and crossover rings located, go ahead and drive the car. You're going to notice a ton of improvement. Much more plush ride quality through the normal mid-stroke. A ton more resistance in the places that you need it the most. Big jump landings, G-outs, big whoops, big hits. The car will have less bucking and kicking than it does stock and feel a lot more stable through the rough. If you're looking for more of this same type of improvement, you might have noticed in this installation video that we've actually done the internal shock work too, our ride improvement system internal work. If you're looking for more out of your suspension, then our internal work would be the next step. Our ride improvement suspension system modifies the inside of the shock, makes it even more plush than the spring kit already allows, and gives you a much more progressive system into the bump stage. It's the perfect mated system to go with your spring kit if you want more out of your car. We really hope this installation video has helped the process of installing our kit. We know that you're going to love this kit as much as we do. If you have any other questions, feel free to call us at the shop, 623-217-4959, or contact us at shocktherapist.com. We also have written instructions on our website under the Instructions tab. And for more great tutorials, check out our YouTube channel at Shock Therapist. Jesus. How
little bit
close
back.
do you really want me to you?
Close as
Me. Set those on the workbench if you want. Cool. Mm-hmm.
Couldn't look you in the eye.
Now compress the springs and remove the lower factory spring retainer.
But I'm a creep. I'm a widow.
Have somebody else measure ride heights to determine whether the car needs to be raised or lowered from our starting point.
Alright, go underneath there and act like you're measuring something and I'll meet you down there.